Hi guys, welcome back to Current Affairs Unfiltered. I'm your host, Paige Fullman. So for starters, I am recording this at about noon Eastern on Friday, March 21st. So anything that happens on Saturday or Sunday before this gets released is not my responsibility. This week, we're going to be covering some of the chaos that has been going on. I say it almost every time I have a solo episode, but it just feels like so much happens, and doing this podcast has just taught me how effective Trump's flood the zone kind of strategy is, because I feel like I get inundated with so many news updates and then I can't even sort through what I feel like is the most important and integral. But also at the same time, I do like to keep my episodes at least a little bit light and pull some of the more bizarro, quirky stories of the last couple weeks. But anyways, this week we got a whole host of stories. We're going to cover Elon Musk and Mark Kelly beating each other up on the internet. The U.S. landed itself on a human rights watch list, and Trump flirting with getting rid of the First Amendment, which is so awesome for democracy in our country. And to top it all off, we're going to take a trip to 1934 France to discuss their insurrection and how it deeply mimics the U.S. To start things off, we're going to talk about the Elon Musk versus Mark Kelly fight. This time, Musk has called Senator Mark Kelly, a former astronaut and U.S. Navy captain, a traitor for traveling to Ukraine to show support during this critical moment in a response on Twitter. Musk responded to one of Kelly's tweets of him being in Ukraine, saying, quote, "You are a traitor," send tweet. To which Kelly responded, quote, "Traitor? Elon, if you don't understand that defending freedom is a basic tenet of what makes America great and keeps us safe, maybe you should leave it to those of us who do." Kelly then went further in comments to the media. Apparently, showing solidarity with a country defending itself against an invasion is now grounds for treason in Musk's world, and in Trump's world, I guess. Musk's comments are not that shocking and surprising. I think Mark Kelly handled it well. And in the days that followed, unrelated, although I'm sure it does have some relation to the exchange that they had on Twitter, Mark Kelly ditched his Tesla and got an SUV, which was not Tesla branded. I don't think he's confirmed or denied if the Twitter sparring had anything to do with his decision to get rid of the Tesla. I think he might have said that it was because of Doge, which, duh. But I do think the whole getting rid of Teslas things is at least a little bit funny. And it's funny to watch that the people that Elon targeted with his Teslas was the libs. It was the people that wanted these electric cars, that wanted the inconvenience of charging them. And to see people turn away from them and put different decals on them, it's a little bit funny, as his stock is absolutely tanking and investors in Tesla are starting to kind of panic about it. So kudos to Mark Kelly for getting the jump on that one. Next up, we're going to talk about something that should give all of us a little bit of pause. The U.S. has landed itself on a human rights watch list over, quote, threats to civic freedoms under the Trump administration. The U.S. has landed itself on the Civicus Human Rights Watch list, which specifically draws attention to countries where there is a decline in respect for civil spaces. In addition to the U.S., they added the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Italy, Pakistan, and Serbia. Just for context on who our buddies are in this watch list, they also said that gross abuses of executive power raise serious concerns over the freedoms of peaceful assembly, expression, and association. When we talk about America being a beacon of democracy, this is a huge red flag that signals that we're moving in the wrong direction. The U.S., in my opinion, should not show up on any human rights watch lists. It's not a great look. When countries in Europe are also administering travel alerts to the U.S. and putting us on travel watch lists, and people are being turned away and detained at the border despite being residents or having proper papers, it's just overall not a good look. It's embarrassing. And a lot of the conservative response has really been, oh, this is the liberal media at it again, causing panic when, I don't know, when other places get put on human rights watch lists or any sort of watch list, the attention is immediately to, what did they do? What can we do to help and fix it? And this is a huge red flag. It is staring us right in the face. And if our response is anything other than, let's get out of this, there's problems. I will put a link to the Civicus announcement that the U.S. is on the watch list in the show notes of this if you guys want to go check it out. They do seem to do a pretty good job at outlining why countries end up on their watch list. It doesn't seem to be, a willy-nilly throw people on there just for shits and giggles, but this should be something that we take seriously, looking at global media and lists like this that are talking about the US in a generally objective way. People like to make fun of America overseas. Everybody's fat and diseased and ugly, whatever you want to say. That's fine. But media spaces like this are trying to inform the public in a way that is generally nonpartisan. And nothing really in their announcement is very partisan, except for saying that Trump is limiting civil liberties, which, yeah, he is. Going off of that, my next story is about Trump declaring protests and the media illegal. So, yeah, maybe we did earn that spot on the watch list. In a series of alarming statements, Donald Trump suggested that protests on college campuses could be deemed illegal, threatening to remove funding from universities that, quote, allow illegal protests, adding that, quote, agitators will be imprisoned or permanently sent back to the country from which they came. American students will be permanently expelled or, depending on the crime, arrested. Okay, this would, in my opinion, clearly violate the First Amendment. Free speech is free speech. Protesting is in the First Amendment. Even if you disagree with it, it is still in the First Amendment. And again, this just goes back to what I've been harping on for the last 2 months. This is clear hypocrisy. You can't claim that only you get to do the First Amendment. When Trump was banned from Twitter, it was all, this is a violation of the First Amendment, whatever. Okay, well, so is you declaring protests that don't align with your agenda as being illegal. I can't understand how he and his administration wake up every morning and try to make the story and timeline that they've created in their head and in the media of like how this all makes sense, because I do agree sometimes with like his free speech claims, like, while at the same time I think that the internet needs more moderation in terms of speech because it is the town square essentially. I think we do have a responsibility to quell hate speech and speech that incites negative feelings towards certain groups. At the same time, I do understand the concerns about voices being silenced on social media by Trump and right-wingers. As long as that's not hateful, I think everybody should be able to share their opinion. But, very key but, you can't claim to support those right-wing ideas and then turn around and say, by the way, I will not support the free speech of these left-wing ideas. Doubling down on that, he called CNN and MSNBC illegal, stating in comments to the DOJ that, quote, I believe that CNN and MSNBC, which is what he calls MSNBC, who literally write 97.6% bad about me, would love to know who gave him that figure, are political arms of the Democrat Party, and in my opinion, they're really corrupt and they're illegal. What they do is illegal. Again, what bizarre and unprecedented accusation against a major news network. It is also ironic. This specifically, again, the hypocriticalness of all of this, because this is literally what Breitbart. I'm going to go with Breitbart. This is what Breitbart and Fox News do for him. All they do is write negative stories about Democrats, and they are literally an arm of the Republican Party, to the point that there is proof out there that they are literally going directly to like the Trump administration and staff of Republicans and pushing out the stories that they want put out there. All I'm going to say of that is that every accusation is a confession in this case, because they are using their own right-wing media to do the same exact thing that he's accusing CNN and MSNBC of doing. These comments are legally baseless, and honestly, all they do is reflect a growing authoritarian regime that is attempting to delegitimize dissent and critical media by framing the opposition, in this case CNN and MSNBC, as criminal. He's continuing to erode those democratic norms. And I think we as the public kind of underestimate the power of words. I think, if you tell people over and over again, these places are criminal, these places are dishonest, these places and people are bad, people start to believe it. Everybody is susceptible to propaganda. Everybody is susceptible to words. I mean, think about it like when you're a kid. If your parents keep telling you that you have to do the dishes, eventually you're going to do the dishes. If your parents keep telling you that a friend is bad news, eventually you are going to think a friend is bad news. It really is just an erosion of these cornerstones of democracy, the press and the right to protest. And I understand that his words are just words at this point. That doesn't make them any less scary, and it again, who he's speaking to when he's saying these things is his base, who does get riled up and does have the wherewithal, I guess, to act on these words and threaten people and the media, etc. Like I said, based on this alone, I'm starting to see why we have now ended up on a human rights watch list. Makes sense when you look at that story. All right, moving on to everybody's favorite governor, Tim Walz of Minnesota has broken his silence. He recently said what a lot of people were thinking, that Democrats played it too safe in 2024. While the fear of losing to Trump loomed large in the race for president, Walz pointed out that the party's cautious approach may have cost them the ability to inspire and mobilize voters. Playing defense instead of offense can only get you so far, and it's a lesson that Democrats might need to take to heart while heading into the next election cycle in 2026 and especially in 2028. I do think that this rings true, especially when you consider who Walz was before being tapped for VP. He really made his mark by getting on the news and calling Republicans weirdos, which everybody was like, oh my God, so true, Tim Walz. And then once he got tapped for VP, they basically had a muzzle on him, and he had no more of those like good, witty, off the cuff moments. And while we saw parts of who he was as a person, as a father, as a citizen, I think we have seen more of who he was as those characters and, you know, parts of his identity after he stopped running for vice president. I think Hope Walz, his daughter, I'm sure they were telling her, like, you know, pipe down on social media, don't, you know, make this weird, whatever. But after Tim Walz and Kamala lost, I feel like she gave us such insight into her dad and who he would have been as vice president. And if you don't follow Hope Walz on TikTok or Instagram, I do suggest that you do. She posts a lot of really insightful things and really comes across as like a voice of reason. She's constantly getting attacked by Republicans, and she just has such an even-keeled response to all of it. And I think that's very indicative of who her father is and how he raised her. Anyways, I do think that Tim Walz has a point, and I'm happy that he's speaking out about this and kind of starting to, I don't want to say rally the troops, but realigning the troops into what 2026 and 2028 is going to be, in that you can't play it safe because, and while it might be reactionary, you can't just let the Republicans run amok and control the narrative. And I think that's just been a reoccurring theme that's been going on for years, but it was especially prevalent in the 2024 election and then now. And speaking of that, Chuck Schumer rolled over for the Republicans to vote for their budget bill. Instead of standing firm on progressive priorities or pushing back against harmful provisions that were in the bill, Schumer chose compromise over confrontation, although I'm not even sure that it was a compromise because Democrats didn't gain anything. They signed the bill or pushed it to go forward as is without pushing back at all. And it's just another example of Democrats conceding ground when they could be holding the line, which leaves many wondering, is this approach sustainable? Schumer and 8 others voted for it along with 1 independent. It was literally just so embarrassing because there wasn't even a negotiation, and watching them try to spin it and be like, oh, we had to do what we had to do. And you could already see like the pieces falling into place because, and everybody with eyes and that followed it semi-closely knew it was going to happen because Republicans have been saying for months, oh, if the government shuts down, it's Democrats' fault. Okay, well, no, that's not necessarily true. Like, yes, they're the ones not voting for it, but maybe you should make a better bill. Have they ever thought about that? Whatever. But bottom line, there was no negotiation. They looked at the bill. They totally had room to negotiate. They've done it in the past. And the other issue with this bill is it wasn't clean. So there were cuts to certain areas. There was extra funding to certain areas. And that was why Republicans threw a fit. I think the last time they posted a resolution was because it wasn't clean. There was adjustments to the funding levels in certain places. And that was where Elon Musk got on Twitter and was like, clean CR, which means continuing resolution. And everybody lost their minds. And then guess what? A clean continuing resolution passed. Not sure why that couldn't happen this time. Like, I don't know. That's why, I mean, it's just embarrassing. Like, you didn't even try. You didn't even try to stand up and say, we're only voting for it if you cut these things, because it wasn't going to pass if they couldn't get Democrats on. Like, I'm just mind blown by this. Like, I truly have no insight as to why this happened unless I get conspiratorial about it. But the one thing that was in the bill that I like just deeply was like, what in the world is going on, was cuts to things like the DC government. The DC mayor, Muriel Bowser, and some of the elected officials within DC government went to Capitol Hill and said, can you guys not do that? Because then we're going to have to make cuts to things like public services, firefighters, police, teachers, and really, I think this goes back to Trump having a gripe with DC, considering it votes 96% Democrat, I think. And Nikki Haley was the one that won the Republican primary there. So he's got gripes everywhere. He's got no buddies in DC. But I love that city. I lived there for 2 years and I loved everything about it. And ultimately, this harms nobody but the people that call DC home. I was a transplant. There are plenty of people that live there that aren't government workers. There are teachers and firefighters and police officers and all the other people that call DC home that don't work in this government that Donald Trump is trying to dismantle. So that's the thing that I'm the most upset about in this continuing resolution. There are other problems, but the whole bill was a mess, genuinely. And everything, the fact that Democrats voted for it without much of a fight, if any, is disappointing. And my own senator, Dick Durbin, voted for it. My other senator, Tammy Duckworth, did not. Thank you, Tammy. And what I will say, I talked about it on a episode, I think it was last month. I messaged all of my elected officials and was like, guys, what are you doing? Guys, stand up. Dick Durbin responded, and his response didn't even make sense to what I was saying. Hot take, okay? I hope somebody primaries him. Because if he doesn't retire, I hope somebody primaries him because this will be so key to somebody running against him. And I really don't understand it because a lot of the people that ended up voting for the CR were people that were in purple-ish places where this is what they need to do to get reelected. But Dick Durbin, baby, he can run on name recognition alone. Everybody in Illinois knows who that guy is. Like, that's the one I really don't understand. And maybe it's because he's the second in command, so he just had to get behind Schumer on this so as not to create a fractured party within the Senate. But still, Dick Durbin is on my shit list. I did intern for him, and it's tough to say that because I know his staff works hard, but it just makes me sad that that's who my elected official is, because that was a place that I was proud to work for. I felt like I was doing good work, and it's shameful when somebody that I felt like embodied my values and embodied the values of the majority of Illinois residents is now turning around and voting for something that was literally a flaming pile of garbage. Moving on to archaic laws, Donald Trump recently invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to authorize the deportation of individuals identified as members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. The act, part of the Alien and Sedition Acts, grants the president authority to detain or deport non-citizens from hostile nations, keyword, during wartime. Notably, this is the first invocation of the act since World War II, when we interned Japanese Americans, which was also a disgraceful thing to do. The administration's actions have led to the deportation of over 250 Venezuelan nationals to El Salvador's terrorism confinement center, which is arguably the worst prison to ever exist. Critics are arguing that these deportations were conducted without due process, often based on tenuous evidence such as tattoos interpreted as gang affiliations. For example, Agnello Jose Sarabia, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, I'm so sorry, a 19-year-old asylum seeker was deported due to a rose tattoo that officials associated with Tren de Aragua, despite his lack of criminal history. They are really just doing this like flying by the seat of their pants. Oh, you got a rose tattoo? Better get on that plane. What type of country is that where somebody's tattoo can get them deported? Legal challenges have obviously arisen, with organizations like the ACLU arguing that the Alien Enemies Act is a wartime measure inappropriate for peacetime use. I would agree. I think what he's trying to do is trying to figure out the loophole, and I just am not sure that there is one. A federal judge issued an emergency order to halt the deportations, but officials claimed the order came too late to prevent them because the plane that they put these apparent gang members on was already in the air. and over international waters. As if you couldn't just contact the pilot and say, hey, can you turn that one around? What do you mean? The use of the 18th century law in the current context has sparked significant debate about executive power, due process rights, and the treatment of non-citizens within the United States. Clearly, in my humble opinion, this is such an overreach and so like grasping at straws to try and get people deported that most of the time it seems like don't even need to be deported or they just wouldn't have the proper grounds for deportation. The one thing I don't really understand in all of this is that if they really were criminals and gang members, he could easily go about like the established processes for getting people like that deported. I'm just confused on if he thinks that because he's using this act, then they don't need to provide any evidence. I don't know, because if they went the quote-unquote legal route that's already established, all they would have to do is show evidence that, one, this person is in a gang, and two, they're here illegally and doing illegal activities. That's it. Then you can deport them. So I'm just not really understanding the thought process here. Either way, egregious, but honestly, I say this, swear to God, with every single thing that he does, this really just seems like one of those things where he's flooding the zone and trying to make people go, what in the world is going on? That's all it feels like. All right, now here's where things get a little bit weird. The Enola Gay, which if you don't know what that is the aircraft that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, has been banned from certain museums and exhibits due to DEI concerns. Just want you to soak that one in for a minute. The U.S. Department of Defense has initiated a comprehensive review to eliminate content related to diversity, equity, and inclusion from its systems following an executive order by President Trump. This effort has led to the flagging of approximately 26,000 images, including photographs of the Enola Gay. The aircraft was not named for the LGBTQ community. It was named after the pilot's mother, Enola Gay Tibbets. The inclusion of the Enola Gay images in The Purge appears to stem from an overzealous interpretation of the term gay as it relates to the LGBTQ context, rather than looking at the historical context. I am pretty certain that the person that flagged this was like a reporter that was like, hold on, you can't just get rid of the Enola Gay. They're not even checking their work. I know it's annoying to check your work. When I was a kid, I never checked my work. But when you're removing historical things, pictures, items, you got to check your work and make sure that you're not erasing like literal life-altering history. It just feels like they took all of the terms within the images, slapped it into an AI machine and said, spit me back out the ones that say gay or woman or whatever marginalized group they felt like targeting that day. But it's just too broad and risks, as we can see, erasing significant historical records and just also reflects the errors in the way they're going about removing stuff. And it also just shows the unintended consequences, I guess, of his policy, because by his policy standards, yes, I'm sure a word like gay would be banned. I hate to say that. But when you look at it under the context of it's the name of the plane that dropped the atomic bomb, like there should be an exception for that. They haven't said anything about it, about like reversing course on reinstituting pictures of the Enola Gay, but I guess we'll see. I just found that story to be the slightest bit entertaining, because what do you mean you flagged the pictures of the Enola Gay for removal? In another Doge takeover, they have taken over the U.S. Institute of Peace. The institute was founded in 1984 to promote conflict resolution and peace-building efforts. It is now under the control of an entity focused on turning public institutions into profit-driven ventures. Peace usually is not profitable, just so we're clear. On March 17th, Doge personnel entered the U.S. Institute of Peace headquarters, removing acting President George Moose and staff members. The forceful entry led to a legal challenge by former board members who described the takeover as a, quote, unlawful assault. A federal judge expressed concern over Doge's aggressive tactics, but declined to halt the takeover, allowing Doge to maintain control over U.S. IP. Of course, this incident is part of a broader effort by the Trump administration to streamline government operations by basically eliminating agencies that they consider unnecessary. Similar actions have been reported at other federal entities, as I've talked about in literally every single episode. This also does just fall into the conversation about debates between balancing efficiency, which I think any reasonable person thinks the government should be more efficient, and also the autonomy of these independent organizations. I don't think the average American would say we need less peace in the world, which makes taking this place over even weirder. I'm sure they said something mean about Trump, and Trump was like, go in there and knock him dead. I don't know. But it's a very odd agency to take over. I don't want to say I understand, but I understand them going to USAID and, other social services and Treasury, whatever. That's their goal, is to dismantle these big organizations like that. But to go into the US Institute of Peace, what were they hoping to find there? I can't imagine that is taking up that much money of the federal budget. What were they looking for? And Elon Musk hasn't said anything about it, so, we don't know what they were looking for and what they were all mad about when they marched in there in the first place, but I'd be curious to know, because it's such a tiny organization that's so insignificant to the budget that I just can't think of any other reason they'd want to go in there other than to be malicious. But on the other hand, a judge has ordered USAID to resume operations after Trump attempts to gut the agency. USAID, which, as we've talked about, plays a critical role in delivering humanitarian aid and supporting democracy abroad. It was effectively shut down by Trump's executive orders. People cleared out their desks. They got 15 minutes to show up and clear out their desks, I think, a couple weeks ago. The judge's decision does just reaffirm the importance of USAID's mission and signals that even amid efforts to dismantle it, the court remains a key line of defense. We should always keep an eye on the courts because it's getting scarier. He's threatening to just stop listening to the court rulings every day. He gave a non-answer at an interview the other day where I think it was Caitlin Collins from CNN. She'd asked him, would you ever ignore a court order? And he basically said, no, I would never ignore a court order, but there shouldn't be a but. Just no, I wouldn't ignore a court order. Anyways, he said, I wouldn't ignore a court order, but something about when the judges are corrupt and bad and whatever, you got to do what you got to do. No, that's not how that works. That's not how that works. Anyways, no word on what this court order actually did. I imagine it's going to be tough to get former workers to show back up because it's so volatile. At this point, you don't know if you go back, are you going to be fired again in 6 months? Because then what? So I guess keep an eye on this. Eager to know kind of where this ends up because, as I've said in previous episodes, USAID is so critically important to our influence abroad and deeply impacts the lives of people overseas and impacts how the U.S. is able to maneuver in international spaces, if that makes sense. On March 20th, Donald Trump signed an executive order directing the dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education, aiming to transfer educational authority back to the states and local communities. I watched that press conference live yesterday, and he literally every other sentence out of his mouth was, we're going to send it back to the states, it's going to be glory, the whole cadence that he does. But every other sentence was, we're sending it back to the states, it's going to be awesome. Oklahoma? You want Oklahoma to do all the legwork? They're 50th in education. Is that really going to fix it? Anyways, some key aspects are that it mandated the Department of Education's closure beyond its core necessities, ensuring the continuation of essential services such as Title I funding for low-income schools, Pell Grants, and support for students with disabilities. So essentially, if you listened to my episode last week about the Department of Education, what I'm gathering from this is that all it's really eliminating is the research portion, which is the bulk of their work. It is important to note that fully dissolving a federal department requires congressional approval. While the executive order sets the process in motion, the actual closure can't occur without legislative action. Given the current political landscape, achieving such approval is going to be a challenge. I think I saw a poll the other day that said 60% of Americans disagree with closing the Department of Education. Trump did get on stage and say this is overwhelmingly popular with the people. So who am I to believe at this point? But that does make me think that getting it over the finish line in Congress is going to be risky. As much as the Republicans in Congress aren't doing much to combat Trump, I don't think they're going to bring something like that to the floor and put their name on it, because they seem to be okay with going along with his agenda, but when they have to put their own name on his agenda, that's a lot of times where I think it gets a little dicey for them because, of course, they have to go home and explain themselves. This, much with the dismantling of USAID, you got to keep an eye on it and see if they make any moves legislatively. I know Marjorie Taylor Greene when he closed USAID, did put forth a bill to officially close USAID. It's gone nowhere, in case you were wondering. It's just difficult for me to kind of see the long term here. I think he's creating as much chaos and damage as he can. Obviously, we do know it's going to take years, if not decades, to rebuild what he's destroyed in 2 months. And I think this plays into it. I think some of the House Republicans are kind of hoping that when Trump leaves, if they haven't, by law, by passing a bill, dismantled these departments, that they'll be able to make a comeback in some capacity. I don't know. It just feels weird that Trump is saying, oh, this is so popular, this is so awesome. But then his Republicans in Congress aren't then following up and being like, I don't understand why he's doing it through executive order. Because if it's so popular and everybody loves it, why don't you just pass it through Congress? They have control of the House and the Senate, so just do it. I don't know. The other thing I wanted to talk about, got this news alert this morning, so I don't have any prepared notes, but Elon Musk is set to get a high-level classified briefing on potential plans for war with China. That's not to say we're going to war with China, but the U.S. government does keep, hypotheticals locked in the chamber in case something goes awry and they need to pull those out. Because the last thing you would ever want is to be caught with your pants down in a time of war. So having these plans drawn up is not a huge deal. The fact that Elon Musk is getting a briefing on this is alarming. We're still not sure if he has a security clearance. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is, what does Elon Musk, who is supposed to be heading up Doge and be a special advisor, why does he need that information? Why does Elon Musk need to know about our potential war plans with China? If you have an answer, I'd love for you to let me know what your thought process is on this, because after I read it this morning, I truly sat there for 15-20 minutes and was like, can I think of one even okay reason why he might need these? And then when I was thinking about why he might want them for, his own personal gain, I still couldn't even think of much. I'm just not sure what benefit this is providing to him and what benefit it's providing to Trump. Elon Musk is by no means a China expert, but here he is getting these high-level briefings on a topic that really doesn't seem to affect him. Okay, wait, now I have an article up and I'm honestly even more confused. So this says that the meeting was orchestrated by Pete Hegseth, my favorite DUI hire, my king, my kill all Muslims screaming at the bar king, initiated the meeting and then asked Musk to come for a briefing. Oh my God, wait, the girls are fighting. I'll link to the article that I'm reading right now in the show notes. But so this Washington Post article says that the meeting was intended to be unclassified, but the report that broke this morning from the New York Times said Musk would receive a, quote, top secret briefing that would include plans on how the United States would fight China in a war. Hegseth denied the report late Thursday, saying on social media that the meeting is, quote, about innovation, efficiencies, and smarter production. Okay, I'm not sure how much I believe that. I'm just not sure about all that, especially because Musk is already privy to some information with his contracts, just based on what the U.S. government buys from him. I'm unconvinced that it was just a strategic meeting about the vibes. Anyways, that's all I have for you guys in terms of news. I did want to talk a bit about, so I read a book over the weekend called Tyranny of the Minority. It is written by Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levitsky. They're the same people that wrote How Democracies Die. And in it, there was a really interesting story about France in 1934. I kind of wanted to go over that just so you guys can see the sort of parallels that, in my opinion, were jumping out of the pages as I was reading. So you guys tell me how familiar this ends up sounding. Basically, in 1934, there was a left-ish wing party in power. They weren't very left-wing. They were just moderate. And there was a little bit of unrest, kind of fueled by a financial scandal, government corruption, and right-wing groups ended up accusing the government of covering up the scandal. Additionally, France was in the throes of the Great Depression, which led to widespread discontent. Then there was also the right wing that was deeply fearful of communism and believed that the government that was in charge at that moment was too weak and too tolerant of leftist movements. The protests were massive. Police ended up opening fire on the protesters. This is not similar to the American version, killing 15 people and injuring over 1,400. The violence forced the prime minister to resign the next day. He was kind of hoping to appease those right-wingers that were so pissed off, and it didn't really work in appeasing them, and they ended up electing a more conservative government. The crisis deepened political divides in France, strengthening, in their case, both far-right and far-left movements. Now, the issue is that after the riot, in which they were descending on parliament and threatening violence and saying they were going to kill the politicians inside, the government had a weak response. They did not aggressively prosecute the rioters. Instead of cracking down on these far-right groups, as I said, the prime minister just resigned in the face of these far-right groups. And when the right-wing guy took over afterwards, he sought political stability rather than punishment. The other thing was that a lot of these far-right groups were deeply entrenched with the right-wing politicians in French parliament at the time, which made taking legal action against them, and for some of these right-wingers standing up and saying, hey, they need to be prosecuted, it made it politically risky. Instead of disbanding them and cracking down on them immediately, government officials delayed taking action, which then allowed them to regroup and continue their activities. There was no action even taken against the leaders of these right-wing groups that basically organized it. The lack of punishment and their entrenchment with right-wing people in France's government encouraged further political extremism in France, and soon after, France would fall to the Nazis and a Nazi-sympathetic government. Because they were more focused on restoring stability, they did not prosecute these people, and because they did not prosecute these people, the right-wing groups were able to stay deeply connected and therefore made the government more susceptible to Nazi brand fascism when it showed up at their doorstep. Ultimately, I think it goes without saying, but I think this is deeply reflective of what we saw on January 6th. Yes, people were prosecuted, but because Republicans in government did not get behind those prosecutions, they really held little weight, which is why Donald Trump felt so emboldened to just release the insurrectionists from prison. I think that the story is a tale of warning. We obviously can't go back and, redo history, but I do think it's important to keep this in mind with what we're seeing. And a lot of it is because more broadly than just January 6th, going all the way back to stuff like the Tea Party in the mid-2000s, not nipping stuff like that in the bud has long-term implications. The Tea Party is what has led us to the Freedom Caucus. Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, who's no longer there, thank God, Lauren Boebert, all those people. Those groups are directly connected to each other in terms of like a historical timeline. And the Freedom Caucus is directly connected to things in the timeline, such as those far-right militias. And when we're not nipping that in the bud and we're giving them the space to talk their talk, and politicians and elected officials are also not calling it out as being what it is, which is hateful, dangerous, we are setting the stage for being open to fascism, which I think we are seeing right now. Donald Trump is yelling about canceling the press and canceling free speech. That should be alarming. And yet no Republican officials are standing up and calling it what it is. You cannot be both victimized and the victimizer, which is what Donald Trump and a lot of his cronies in Congress are trying to do. They want to be the victim so bad. They were oppressed so bad. They have it so hard. Everybody wants to oppress them. Everybody hates white Christian males, whatever. But then at the same time, they will turn around and oppress other people, which both cannot be true at once. You cannot be victimized and also victimize other people. Anyways, that was just an interesting story that I read. Loved the book, Tyranny of the Minority. Basically what the book was about was laying the case for reforms around democracy in our Constitution. It was written before Trump won again, so it is a little bit out of date in that way. Like, they say some lines and I'm like, okay, well, that's not true because he literally got reelected again. But nonetheless, a lot of their arguments still stand true in terms of why they should be implemented. So if you have some free time, I really do recommend you go and read that book. But bottom line being, that was a really interesting story about France, and I really started to get sick to my stomach when I was reading it, because I was like, oh my God, that's us. Oh my God, they didn't punish them. That's us. So embarrassing. Anyways, the other thing I wanted to say, I talked about this on like one of my first solo episodes. I think I mentioned it briefly earlier in this episode. But anyways, I reached out to all of my elected officials. Dick Durbin, I reached out maybe like 6 weeks ago, okay? Dick Durbin is the only one who has responded so far. I understand, okay? They are probably being inundated with messages from everybody and their mother. Dick Durbin is the only one that responded, and it wasn't even a response that made sense to my message. It was kind of on brand, but I was like, y'all can't edit a sentence to make it fit with what I said to you and whatever. Anyways, but Tammy Duckworth has yet to respond, and I did see on Reddit that she has turned off her phones. Again, that does happen if they're getting inundated with phone calls. Sometimes they just turn them off. Yeah. If you do message your elected officials, just know that they are not the ones reading it. The person that is reading it is probably a 19 to 22-year-old college student who has been tasked with letter writing duty for the day. I like to, when I send my elected officials messages, I add a little PS at the end to the intern, and I say, I'm sorry that you have to read this, but I need my letters on the record. I need my words on the record, please. Anyways, but I'm still waiting for a response from Tammy Duckworth and my representative, who I'm starting to get fed up with her. I don't really want to say her name because I feel like that narrows down my location too much, but I'm getting fed up with her, and somebody needs to primary her too. Anyways, that is all that I have for today. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Current Affairs Unfiltered. I will be taking next week off since March is a little bit weird and it has 5 weeks, and I will be back on April 7th with a guest episode. I'm not quite sure who the guest is yet, but rest assured it'll be a good one. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow, leave a review, or share it with somebody who could use this information. And as always, if you have questions, topic suggestions, or just want to say hi, you can find me on social media at Current Affairs Unfiltered Pod on Instagram, or send me an email at currentaffairs.unfilteredpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. Keep asking questions, stay engaged, and remember to prosecute the insurrectionists. I will see you guys in 2 weeks.